It's a privilege to be with you, genuinely. Thank you. The period following the Civil War is known in U.S. history as Reconstruction. It lasted from 1863 to 1877, and it has been called, quote, one long referendum on the meaning and memory of the verdict reached at Appomattox, unquote. That is to say, the Union had won the war on the battlefield, but what would be the long-term meaning of victory in the face of the abolition of slavery and the nature of future government in the southern states? Reconstruction was marked by several efforts. Number one, to rebuild the war-torn nation. Number two, to readmit the Confederate states into the Union. Number three, to help those states to rebuild in the face of the war's near total destruction of certain areas. Number four, to facilitate the reenfranchisement of white voters in the 11 secessionist states. Number five, to determine and guarantee the rights of approximately 4 million freed slaves in the South. And last but not least, to somehow try to help ease the human suffering. The latter is the consequence that strikes one, I think, most immediately about the aftermath of the Civil War. That is the almost incomprehensible suffering experienced by so many, but largely escaped by the Latter-day Saints in Utah, relatively speaking. In many regions of the South, ex-Confederates faced, I touched something. In many regions of the South, the ex-Confederates faced not just crushing material poverty, but what has been described as spiritual hopelessness. I think that's an area that could use more investigation. The most costly aspect of the Civil War by far was the human life taken and the suffering inflicted. In fact, the greatest that the United States has ever seen. This was also the most tragic dimension of this massive and wrenching conflict. The estimated number of soldiers, both North and South, who were killed between 1861 and 1865 is estimated at over 620,000. Put that in perspective, in modern times, the equivalent between 6 and 7 million lives today. In one sense, it's really impossible to comprehend the suffering that this human destruction generated, and therefore I think sometimes monotonous to try to continue to describe it. Yet, in another sense, it is impossible to speak too much about the suffering because of the way it has shaped the United States. Professor Drew Faust, whose book, This Republic of Suffering, was only this last week featured on a PBS special, has written the following, quote, in the Civil War, the United States, North and South, reaped what many participants described as a harvest of death. By the midpoint of the conflict, it seemed that in the South, nearly every household mourned some loved one lost. Every household. As a Confederate soldier observed, death reigned with universal sway, ruling homes and lives, demanding attention and response. The Civil War matters to us today because it ended slavery and helped to define the meanings of freedom, citizenship, and equality. But for those Americans who lived in and through the Civil War, the texture of the experience, its warp and woof, was the presence of death. That's the end of the quotation. Indeed, it seems that death did transform the American nation, as well as the hundreds of thousands of individuals directly affected by loss. The effect of death created what Frederick Law Olmsted referred to as the Republic of Suffering. As if to emphasize the point, only days after the Confederates surrendered at Appomattox, as you know, as we all know, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and the Union was plunged into a grief more profound, I think, than it could have imagined beforehand. A second issue that strikes one about this period is related to the first, and that is the way that the immense suffering affected two men, two presidents, in fact, Abraham Lincoln and Brigham Young. The first comprehensive effort at Reconstruction is generally regarded as Lincoln's Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, issued on the 8th of December, 1863. And through the proclamation, though the proclamation was issued only halfway through the war, it is clear that the President wanted the conflict to be over. Indeed, the Republic of Suffering was taking its toll on President Lincoln and making him more sensitive, not less sensitive, to the increasing carnage. I think one gets a sense that as the war wore on, Lincoln became more horrified. At one point he exclaimed, "Could we have avoided this bloody, horrible war? Is it ever to end?" The proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction that he proposed required residents of the South, rebels and Confederates, to take an oath to faithfully support, protect, and defend the Constitution and the Union. In addition, the states' constitutions had to abolish slavery, but not all states were required to give free blacks the right to vote. There were at least 3 states that were exempted. Lincoln's plan, of course, stirred controversy. Some wanted him to drop emancipation in exchange for immediate peace with the Confederacy. Others, the radical Reconstructionists, considered the plan to be too lenient on rebels. A national debate ensued over who should establish Reconstruction policies and how they should proceed. And in the meantime, the Senate approved the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, abolishing slavery throughout the Union. Sometimes the Civil War, as we have all heard, is referred to as the Second American Revolution because with the abolition of slavery and the formalized 13th Amendment, some saw America begin to fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. Anti-slavery Congressman Cornelius Cole subsequently declared, after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, "The one large question of the age is settled," quote unquote. But like so much else about the Civil War, if the question had been settled, not everybody understood that, and those in the South didn't get the memo. For Lincoln, there should be no more slaves, no more subhumans, no more North versus South, no unbound wounds, no more second-class citizens, no United States in the plural. Rather, his vision, as God gave him to see the right, contemplated a United States, a single entity, succoring those in need of help and guaranteeing inalienable rights to all. In parallel fashion,